welcome back to my channel, Beautiful Minutia. If you're new here, my name is Tiffany, and today I am kicking off a reading vlog. It's been a while since I did a dedicated reading vlog for just one book for you guys. I do it for my Patreon. Every single month, they choose a book that they've recommended to me for me to do a spoilery reading vlog, but it's been a little while since I've done one on my channel. I tend to more do like a weekly reading vlog. This video is going to be concentrated on Shark Heart by Emily Haybeck, and this book is not my normal cup of tea. So I'm already kind of going into it with quite a bit of apprehension because I don't read a lot of romantic stuff, and this is definitely, it's not really a romance novel from what I understand. I think it's more literary fiction, and I don't read a ton of contemporary literary fiction either. So in a lot of ways, this is very outside my comfort zone. So I kind of am going into this with quite a bit of trepidation, but the reason why I want to read it is because it sounds like the weirdest book ever. And it was a book that ended up being really, really popular last year. It was a Book of the Month book. And one of my friends has a subscription to Book of the Month. And when she read the synopsis of this, she's like, this is so ridiculous. I really want to read it. So she read it with the intention of not liking it, which is kind of why I'm reading it. And she said she ended up actually really liking it. So maybe I will too. And I'm not going to be afraid to come back and tell you I was wrong. If I go into this saying this is going to be absolutely ridiculous, I'm going to give you my honest thoughts, but I'm kind of anticipating this being a ranty vlog, so we'll see if I feel that way. So here's why I think that this is going to be ridiculous. This is just a little tiny paragraph blurb at the beginning that says it's a gorgeous debut novel of marriage, motherhood, metamorphosis, and letting go. This intergenerational love story begins with newlyweds Wren and her husband Lewis, a man who, over the course of 9 months, transforms into a great white shark. So that sounds like the most ridiculous thing ever. It sounds like, you know, it just reminds me of Sharknado, but make it romantic. Actually, I've never watched Sharknado, so I don't really know. But I was just like, what? This is the weirdest thing ever. So I really want to read it. And my friend actually took notes in the margin while she was reading, so I can see her notes as she's reading, and I'm going to use a different color and take notes. And it was someone in my in-person book club. So we're going to pass it on to someone else. We're all going to use different color pens, whoever wants to read it next, and then we can see each other's notes, which I think will make this an even more enjoyable experience. So yeah, I will check in with you in a bit when I've read a little more of this. So far, I've only read just the very opening thing, and it's formatted really, really oddly in that it kind of has... It's set up like a play, which is really, really odd. But I know that the rest of it is not really laid out that way for the most part. I mean, when you get to part 1, it has like characters and stuff, but most of it is just like normal dialogue, or not dialogue, normal like prose. So we'll see how it ends up being. I am only 60 pages in, but I'm already ready for an update because this book is just something else. I don't think anything I could share at this point would actually be spoilery because I'm not very far into it. I haven't even gotten to things that are in the inside flap, so I'm pretty sure that this does not qualify as spoilery, but I don't... Okay, so the way that this book is set up is kind of interesting because you have Lewis, who is the man who is turning into a great white shark, and then you have Wren, this girl that he fell in love with, and they get married. He gets the diagnosis shortly after his marriage, and they are so polar opposites. Like, she's very logical and methodical and keeps to herself, and he's like very outgoing. He's super artsy. He really wanted a career in theater, and that just has not worked out for him. So he's a high school theater teacher. So yeah, so we have two very, very different personalities, and we find out that there's been some trauma and things that have happened to Wren in her past and her childhood, particularly with her mother. But anyways, so he gets the diagnosis. But before he gets the diagnosis, it talks about how he is having these really, really strange symptoms. And one of the first things he says is that his nose no longer has this triangle of bone, but it has soft cartilage. And then it says a week later, Lewis's nose was completely cartilaginous. It looked normal, but he could flatten it with his hand and press it flush against his cheeks. When he shook his head hard, his nose jiggled like he was made of rubber. He showed Wren this new feature as if it were a party trick, but she was horrified. I would be too. And then he talks about more symptoms that he has. He's thirsty all the time, and even though he drank a couple of gallons of water a day, he hardly urinated. Furthermore, his molars were loose, a sensation he has not experienced since childhood. As in childhood, he could feel new teeth coming in beneath the old ones, but these new teeth were not square and blunt. They were sharp, like the end of a knife. And then his skin texture is changing, and he has a decrease in focus, an increase in aggression and irritability, and flashes of strong apathy. And all these things. He also talks about how he feels like nimble and buoyant and like a little insecure when he walks because his joints are turning into cartilage. And this whole process is so weird. But like the way that it's written, like when the doctor gives him the diagnosis, the doctor's just like so matter of fact. And then Lewis and Wren tell Lewis's parents, and Lewis's parents are like, oh, is this one of these animal dementia diseases? And I'm like, are there more? Are there other ones like this in this world? Like, it's in the real world. Everything about it is real, except for the fact that he's turning into a great white shark. And everyone's just like, oh yeah, this is something that happens. Like, it doesn't seem like this is incredibly rare. This is the first time anyone's encountered this. Like, what in the world? Also, of course, right now when I'm trying to film, my neighbor is mowing their lawn, and they weren't when I sat down to film because that is just how it always works. Anyways, I also feel like Lewis is just not that relatable to me, and I'm not as logical of a person as Wren is. I would consider myself more on the creative end of the spectrum, but Lewis is very childish the way that he behaves a lot of times, and he just like chalks it up to like, well, I'm just a creative. Like the fact that on their wedding day, he's standing there crying, and he's not crying because his wife is beautiful or because his mother is crying or because any of these things. He's crying because he's standing in front of 4 trees that were planted when he was a child, and now these trees are full grown, and he's like, we've grown up together, and he refers to these 4 trees as his best men at his wedding in his parents' backyard. And I'm just like, okay. And then later when he's trying to deal with like the crisis of this diagnosis, he's like, I want to live in a treehouse. And even actually before they were married in their premarital counseling, he's like, treehouse living is like a goal of my life. And I'm like, okay. Like, I just like do not relate to this man at all. I do like the fact that they are polar opposites, because he pulls things out of her, like more lightheartedness and more spontaneity, whereas she helps him pull back a bit. And I think that it's so good when opposites are together and they can do those kind of things for each other. So I don't know. The writing itself overall is fine. Like, the writing overall is pretty lovely and I'm enjoying it for the most part. It definitely feels like super literary fiction. So there is a lot of, you know, kind of, it's not really purple prosy. It doesn't take it that far, but there are moments in the writing where it feels like she's trying a little bit too hard. Like, there's one scene where Wren and Lewis are underneath the sky and it's like nighttime and there's a strawberry moon, and he talks about like, as he looks from the moon to his wife, he can't distinguish one from the other. And I'm like, what does that even mean? There are parts where I'm like, okay, this doesn't really work, and it feels like you're trying really hard to be artsy and make this sound really literary, but maybe that's just the way Lewis' brain is supposed to work as well. So I don't know. I am not sure that this book can come back from all this talk about him transforming into a great white shark. I'm really not sure, because it's so ridiculous that it just pulls you right out of the story, and it's so weird. But I'm only 60 pages in. I will say that it's like very readable, and some of the chapters are a few pages long, and some of the chapters are just like a page like this. And then there are moments like this where it feels more play-like, but the fact that Lewis is involved in theater and he wanted to be on Broadway, although it doesn't really talk about him singing very much, but it said he wanted to be on Broadway and moved to New York City. He's a theater teacher. He wants to write a play. And so the interjections of times where it's written almost like a script to a play actually doesn't feel as off-putting and out of place as I thought it would. It kind of works within the context of the story. So I'm trying to be a little bit objective. Even though I went into this saying I was going to hate it, the writing is decent enough that I'm trying to remain objective, that maybe I won't think this whole book is ridiculous, but 60 pages in, and there's more ridiculousness than not so far. Hi, it's time for an update. Excuse the mess. It is laundry day because we're going out of town the day after tomorrow for a couple of days. So at this point in Shark Heart, I'm like a third-ish of the way through. And the further in I get, the harder of a time I'm having taking this book seriously at all. I see what the book is trying to do, I think, especially with Wren, and we're trying to deal with what it feels like to lose a loved one, to prepare yourself for the loss of a loved one. They're talking about Lewis's quick descent into this mutation, and at the point where I've stopped, he's now like basically at stage 4 and there's no stage 5. So it kind of reminds you in a way of, you know, cancer having no stage 5, and then also just like people who are losing their loved ones due to dementia or something like that, where it feels like you're losing them a little bit of the time, and sometimes you have them and sometimes you don't. And I can see what she's trying to do here with that. But I'm just like really struggling with the execution of it, particularly with the fact that we're trying to take this really ridiculous disorder seriously, and there's moments of description that are just so weird. So here's an example of what feeding looks like. It says Lewis ate with his whole body, gnashing at raw tuna, salmon, swordfish, and tilapia. He chewed and slurped while his upper body undulated over the kitchen table. Wren soon gave up on plates and served him on baking sheets. Then Wren relinquished baking sheets and served him on the bare table. Finally, she fed him on the floor, which was most comfortable for Lewis given the fact of his fast diminishing arms, and for Wren, it was easiest to clean. I can't find the passage right now, but it also talks about how his head shape is changing, how like his eyes are becoming black, his eyes don't close anymore because sharks don't have eyelids, and his head shape is changing because his jaws are getting bigger to accumulate all these teeth, and he's losing teeth everywhere. But then there's this that says, as the lingering summer heat eased into comfortable fall days, Lewis's legs began their dramatic transformation. The skin between his inner thighs conjoined, and then the gathering cascaded towards his ankles and feet. He was confined to a wheelchair. To mask his despair about his legs being stuck together, Lewis joked he was in his merman phase. Then it goes on to talk about what a painful process this is, but it's hard for me to take it seriously. Like, I laughed out loud when I read that paragraph. In the midst of all this and them going to this care place that is helping until Lewis is at the point where he needs to be released into the ocean, there's this girl that's there and she's pregnant and she's swimming, and she and Wren become friends. And we get a little bit of the lady's backstory, but just calls her Tiny Pregnant Lady. Like, we never find out her name, which feels kind of odd, especially considering that the lady asks Wren's name and Wren introduces herself, but yet we never get Tiny Pregnant Lady's name. But anyways, so we find out, and this is not actually a spoiler because it's in the inside flap, which I was looking at after I reached this point. We find out she's pregnant with twin birds. Not humans, birds, and they're going to turn into falcons. She writes this poem about her babies and essentially, like, they are going to see her uterus as an eggshell and break out, and she's probably going to die. And all I could think of is, like, too bad these birds aren't ducks, because then they could swim with you. It's just so hard to take this seriously. But then there are moments of, like, these beautiful sentiments, like this sentence right here that says, Wren saw now how passion was delicate and temporary, a visitor, a feeling that would come and go. Feelings fled under pressure. Feelings did not light the darkness. What remained strong in the deep, the hard times was love as an effort, a doing, a conscious act of will. I love that. So it's talking about, hey, all those sweet butterfly feelings you have at the beginning of a relationship, that's not what carries you. And I do love that. And I love her reaction of love. We're getting some of Wren's backstory as well. There's kind of an implication that her mother had dementia, but we don't really know that for sure yet, that she kind of lost her mother in that way. So I can imagine that seeing Lewis decline into moments where he is, like, completely unreachable because instincts are starting to take over, how that would feel so difficult and triggering based on her past with her mother. But we also get her past where she goes away to college and she ends up having this fling with a female professor of theology, of all things. And she ends up having this relationship with this professor who is being portrayed as, like, super loving and that this is a caring and safe relationship. And I just am so put off by that, because I'm like, if this was a man professor that was over a decade older than Wren, we would be like, this is so predatory. But because it's a female professor, it's fine. I don't think it is. You're still taking advantage of a young, naive girl who doesn't know the world and is just, like, away from home and her family for the very first time ever and coming into who she is as a person. And if this was a man, we would be seeing this as predatory, but it's being billed as, like, a loving, caring relationship that Wren just wasn't ready for, because she was too young and too bogged down with her own trauma and baggage that she wasn't ready to release yet. And I just don't buy that. Like, that bothers me so much. The double standard here, I just don't like it. I was really hoping that, you know, maybe I would like this, as I've known people who have read this and went into it expecting to hate it but then liked it. I was going into it with more of an open mind, knowing that. And I'm a third of the way through and I just can't get over how ridiculous this is, and how even, like, I told you about the whole thing with Wren looking like the moon. There's another really, there's like a few weird sentences, like one moment where Lewis hugs Wren after, you know, he's gotten really sick, and it says that her ribs feel like xylophone bars, and it's just, like, such a weird analogy. But when Wren first sees the tiny pregnant woman swimming, it says, when the tiny pregnant woman churned the water, her hands were like spoons turning heavy cream to whipped cream to butter, stroking down the pool and back and down the pool and back and down and back and down and back and down and back and down and back. Some of the writing stylistic choices just aren't working for me either, and pull me out of a moment that might have been fine otherwise. But I'm really struggling. Maybe once Lewis is actually turned into a great white shark, and is in the ocean, and we're dealing with Wren processing her emotions, and I don't have to read about weird shark descriptions anymore, maybe it will feel more emotional and I'll be more invested. I'm not giving up on the possibility of that happening yet when I'm only a third of the way through. But at the point where I am right now, Lewis has done some stuff because he couldn't control his emotions, and the scene even just like, the logistics of the scene don't even make any sense. He like tail slaps people and severely injures them. I'm like, he's sitting in a wheelchair. How's he gonna tail slap someone in the face? Like, that doesn't even make any sense. But whatever. He's now at the point where people are telling Wren it's time that he needs to be released into the ocean. She has like a pool in the backyard that she puts salt in, and he's using gills. It's time for him to go in the ocean. So once he's in the ocean and we're dealing with the rest of Wren's thoughts, the whole feel of the book might be different, and I might get a little more emotionally invested when I'm not constantly hearing about shark anatomy. My friends, I did it. I finished Sharkheart. Last night I finished, I think it was part 2, and I was gonna update you after that, but I am going out of town in a little bit, and I was like, you know what? I'm gonna go ahead and finish this so that way I don't have to bring this book with me on my trip. So I have some things to say. From this point on, it's gonna be spoilers, so you can skip to like a final thoughts section, so that way you can hear my final thoughts that aren't spoilery, but this next section is going to be very spoilery. So I reached to the part where Lewis is released into the ocean, and I couldn't take it seriously. It was supposed to be so emotional, but everything about it was just really, I don't know, like over the top. Like Wren's like, okay, I'm gonna go scuba diving and so I can stay with you, but she hasn't been certified, she hasn't taken any instructions, and so she just can't do it. She's just sinking. And I'm like, girl, this is the person who is like apparently super intelligent, super intellectual, analyzes everything, is super careful, very much a look before you leap kind of a girl, and on a whim she has purchased the scuba diving gear and then just decided to just go with it after practicing once and failing. I realize that grief can make you do things that are out of character, but I feel like if she had thought about this at all, she would have been like, okay, if I really want to stay with Lewis, then what I need to do is I need to practice this. I need to make sure that I can do this so that way I can stay close to him. And she didn't, so then she ends up clinging to his dorsal fin and begging him not to leave. Meanwhile, she's getting like cuts and burns all over her arms because shark skin is super rough. And then for her good, essentially, he ends up leaving. And then Wren, out of grief, sleeps with a random guy at a truck stop. And you're just like, okay. Then after that, we switch entirely, and the whole story like goes back to Wren being born, like her mother, and her mother as a teenager and then a teen mom in an abusive relationship. And to be honest, I really liked that part of the story. I was reading some reviews afterwards and people were like, oh my gosh, I really didn't like that because it just, it seemed like it had nothing to do with the story, which first of all it did because it gives you some basis on Wren's backstory, but secondly, we find out that Wren's mother gets diagnosed with an animal mutation as well, which she doesn't mention at all in the other parts of the story. Like, she makes it sound like it's dementia and she just can't deal with her mother's decline, so she stops seeing her, but in actuality her mother's turning into a Komodo dragon. Now, the mutation time for a Komodo dragon is apparently around 20 years, whereas Lewis's was around, 9-10 months. And so it's very different. But here's the thing. So when Angela starts realizing she gets the diagnosis for this mutation, and we go through all that. There are moments of it that are really ridiculous, but I was able to buy into it a lot more because I felt invested in Angela's story, because we spent a lot of time with her and just her horrible home life, and then her getting with someone who is abusive because she just longs to be loved and cared for, and all of that kind of stuff. And so you really get to know her as a person and her struggles and where she's come from, and her love for her daughter, even though a teenage pregnancy is less than ideal, and this community that she's surrounded herself with, and all this kind of stuff. And then she gets the diagnosis. With Lewis, you get the diagnosis on like page 7, and we don't really get a picture of how happy and in love Lewis and Wren are before we start getting this stuff. We get flashbacks of the beginning of their relationship and stuff, but because it's not told in a linear fashion at all, I didn't have any attachment to the characters, and so everything was just totally ridiculous. With Angela, we get the whole story before the diagnosis because it is more linear. And I think that that helped. And I think that if the author had done that with Lewis and Wren, then maybe I would have been able to invest in it. But I also felt like Lewis's transformation had a lot more like details of what was happening to him physically. Whereas moments of Angela's transformation, there's like a sentence here, a sentence there, not whole paragraphs or pages, just little blurbs here and there. And then like some kind of like horrifying stuff, like a moment where Wren comes home and her mother's covered in like blood and fur because she ate someone's golden retriever because her instincts just took over, which is horrifying and disgusting. I feel like Angela's journey feels a bit more personal and didn't focus on as much of the actual like mutation and transformation as Lewis's did, and so I don't know if that helped or just having the backstory and liking Angela as a character helped more. There were still parts of her transformation that were completely ridiculous, and the fact that this guy who falls in love with her, who's not her baby's father but really loves her, he's obsessed with snakes, and so when she tries to push him away because of this diagnosis, he's like, I love all reptiles. It's the most ridiculous scene. Oh my word, it's so stupid. There was nothing about this book that made me really very emotional. The scenes that were supposed to be tear-jerking, I laughed through most of them because like so much of it was just so very ridiculous. After we get Angela's story, then we seg back to Lewis in the ocean as a shark and his journey to being a shark. It's just so weird because it talks about how the mutation to a great white shark is so fast and their instincts are taking over, so then they have to be released in the ocean and all this stuff. But Lewis is grappling with his memories and all this stuff, and I'm like, he forgot who everyone was at certain points when he was on land, and now he's in the ocean, and this whole time he's just reflecting. He meets another person who has also turned into a great white shark, and she turned as 12 years old, and she has been a great white shark for 12 years, but she still has everything about her that is human in the way that she talks and communicates and in the way she thinks and all her memories. And Lewis starts losing his memories. He starts forgetting what Wren looks like. He has that specific memory, which I think I actually referenced, where he thought that, you know, Wren and the moon were like the same, which was just an oddly written scene that I didn't understand what was going on there. But anyways, he keeps remembering that, and then he realizes he can't remember her face anymore. He's been a great white shark for not that long, a couple of years maybe at the most, and I don't even think it's been that long. And yet he's already losing memories, but this girl that he meets still has all of hers, and she's been a great white shark for 12 years. When they're talking about how the transformation to being a shark is so quick and they become very instinctual and they forget everyone because it's like an animal mutation dementia. And that is not what happens to either of them. They both have their memories, and it doesn't look like dementia. It's so weird the way that this is portrayed. So then we have an epilogue, which is from Wren's point of view, and Wren ends up finding out she's pregnant. And it's really funny because then she talks about how much this baby's like Lewis and how it's a piece of Lewis and how she loves this baby because it's like Lewis. She names the baby Joy, all this stuff. And I'm like, you do realize that you slept with someone at a truck stop right after you dropped Lewis off, like days after? How do you know this is Lewis's baby? because it might not be. All that to say, I'm glad for Wren that she found happiness in the end in motherhood. It's so weird though, because it talks about how she's like, oh, I always wanted to be a mother, and there's so many parts in the books where she was like, I don't want to be a mother. And I don't know if part of that is because we find out at one point through like just a little blurb when Angela's at one of her doctor's meetings that this mutation skips a generation. So maybe that's why Wren didn't want to be a mom, because she knew that this baby had a potential to receive this mutation. And honestly, her struggle when she finds out she's pregnant, I felt like was a more poignant moment of the book, where she is actually considering terminating the pregnancy. She even makes an appointment for that, and then she can't go through with it. But she's like, should I bring a life into the world when there is the potential that this diagnosis is on the horizon for her? And then we won't know for decades whether or not she gets diagnosed with this. And the book ends without us knowing that. But Wren decided to take that chance because she was essentially like, we don't know what life holds. And just because someone's life is short or doesn't end the way that might be ideal through a disorder like this doesn't mean that their life's not worth living, doesn't mean that they don't contribute to the lives of those around them, all that kind of stuff. So there are things about the end that I thought were really good, but I feel like this is a book that has the appearance of and feels like it's striving for depth, but it's not deep. Okay, I'm gonna get into final thoughts, and actually the last thing that I said, I think I'm gonna carry over into this. That this is a book that feels like it's tackling tough issues like grief, loss. What does it mean to really love someone? What does it mean to really be human, to open yourself up, to find community, all these kinds of things. And it feels like it's trying really, really hard to be deep. But what you feel more than the depth is how hard it's trying. At least that's how it felt for me. It felt like it was really surface level. It felt like she was telling us how deep this was rather than it actually being deep. And so I thought that there were moments of beautiful writing, moments where an area is described. We see like Wren and her mother's connection to nature, to the prairie, to all this kind of stuff that is really beautiful. We have descriptions of the beach that's really, really lovely. And then it feels like there are times where there's just really like weird sentences. Wren thought of her lungs thin membranes, pumping oxygen for over 35 years without taking a break. The frailty of her joints and bones and her eyeballs, these fragile mystery meat globs that contained a complicated mechanism for sight, everything she ever knew. And it's like, fragile mystery meat globs? Like, you're trying way too hard. And there are times where she uses words and phrases like that where I'm like, what are you even saying? Like, why? It's so, like, it pulls you out because it's such a weird way to phrase things that feels like it's trying really hard to be artsy. Also, there's weird stylistic choices, which I already mentioned, that we have moments that look like plays. And then there are like huge sections where we have stuff like this, and it goes on for pages and pages and pages, where sometimes there's only like 1 or 2 sentences on a page, and it makes the narrative itself feel super choppy. And it also made me realize as I was reading this that if this book was not laid out this way, this book would be like under 200 pages, and it's over 400 pages. And there's a part of me that's like, this feels like wasteful of paper. Like, this could have been such a short little book in terms of page counts if we didn't do this continually throughout the whole book. That's just a personal preference though. That's just like, it made it feel choppy for me, and it made a bit more sense once Lewis turns into a shark, because I feel like maybe his thought process was not super connected. It was kind of choppy, but like, that's throughout the whole book. That's not just at those points, it's like the whole thing. Anyway, I feel like this book has moments where it talks about, you know, finding joy in circumstances, even when the circumstances are ever shifting. Someone says at a certain point that nothing bad ever lasts, but neither does anything good. And so I feel like there's like notes of hope in them trying to find joy in moments that they know are fleeting. But in the same respect, there's no real hope, because they also don't believe that anything good ever lasts either, and that's how they live their lives. And I'm like, okay, well, I see some of the value of that, of being like, soak it in while it's here, but it's also kind of pessimistic. So I feel like any of the hope that's here feels like really false and shallow hope. I really tried to go into this with an open mind when my friend enjoyed it, and I see why people like this book, because it's so different. And I do think that overall the writing style was compelling enough that there was never a moment I felt bored reading this, and I was really engaged with it, even though most of the engagement was honestly me laughing. Like, there's a point after Lewis turns into a shark where it says, like, it's the beginning of part 3, I think, and we're following Lewis as a shark, and it says, like, reader, you'll have to suspend your disbelief. And my friend who read this and wrote notes in it wrote in that section, what have we been doing this whole time? I thought we've been suspending our disbelief this whole time. And I think that that's why I couldn't take this book seriously at all, is because I couldn't suspend my disbelief enough to actually like enjoy it. Like, this wasn't so fleshed out with all the details that it felt sci-fi-y, but it was specific enough and not vague enough that it felt really detailed. So it felt like it fell in this weird in-between place where it's like, this is not sci-fi, it's more literary, but it's also really weird and has a lot of almost sci-fi feeling, like magical realism details that seem really, really odd. Like, it felt like it was a bunch of things jammed together, which is actually often true of literary fiction, which is why literary fiction can be very hit or miss for me, because I think literary fiction often tries to be a bit experimental, and I feel like this was certainly experimental in its ideas. I've never read anything like this before, but I also felt like the writing style and the way she kind of combined things was pretty experimental as well. We're switching between viewpoints, we're switching between play formats, or choppy things, or things that are even poetry. Like, there's a sentence where it just says, and she kept going and 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 going, and I kid you not, it was at least 25 times in a row. Like, there's a lot of repetition in here as well, and switching between past tense and present tense suddenly with no warning. It's really strange, a lot of the things, and I feel like, again, I feel like it was experimental. That's gonna work really well for some people. It did not work for me. So I will say that if this author writes something else, her writing style was engaging enough that I would try it, because this is a debut novel and it feels like a debut novel to me, and that I feel like, okay, well, with some time and with some honing, I feel like maybe she could write a book that would really, really resonate with me, but this one just didn't. I just couldn't take it seriously. So I guess my overall premise here, and starting out with, I read this so you don't have to, still stands, because I hate read most of it with glee. Like, I laughed a lot at this. So if you love this book, I'm really, really sorry. Because I am definitely like trashing it, but that was my intention going in, because it sounded really ridiculous until I found out that my friend liked it. And then I really did try to be open-minded, and I have talked about things in the book that I did enjoy, especially Angela's story. That was my favorite part, and maybe it was because it was so disconnected from the rest of the story. I think that maybe that's why I enjoyed that element so much. Well, those are my thoughts on Shark Heart. I would love to hear your thoughts in the comments below if you've read this book. I'm really sorry if you enjoyed this book. This book is like really highly rated on Goodreads, but it seems like most people land either on one side or the other. Like, this is so ridiculous, or oh my gosh, this book is beautiful and it changed my life. And I didn't see a whole lot of in between. I saw a lot of 2 and 5-star ratings. There were some 4 as well, but I didn't see that many 3-star ratings. So I feel like there's a wide range. So if you enjoyed this book, I'm so glad, honestly. And that's not me trying to sound snarky or sarcastic. I truly am glad, because I think that this is a book that's going to work for some people, but I am not those people. Thank you so much for watching. If you like this video, please hit like and also subscribe so you can continue to see more bookish content from me, and I will see you again next time.